Hey there, YouTube. I'm Ikitsu. This is the Ikitsu Times. Welcome to my channel. Welcome to a Tuesday talk show. So we're once again going to be talking a little bit about Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and the Persona series. And this one's going back to that framework. And in this particular one, we're going to be talking a little bit about Jungian therapy. So analytical psychology is the school of psychology that Carl Jung left behind. Psychoanalytic is the one that Sigmund Freud left behind. I always get them confused. If I did that here, don't be too surprised. Know that to a large extent in the broader context of things, they're slightly interchangeable in the sense that they both sort of refer to the similar sort of dynamic, and that no one really practices either verbatim anymore. And quite often you'll end up seeing people who are more neo-Freudians or neo-Jungians who don't necessarily use actual psychoanalytics or analytical psychology. They're using something more of a modern blend of concepts and ideas that sort of draw upon both to a certain extent. Some people will lean more to Freud, some will lean more to Carl Jung. Some people will have a little bit of both, and some people will just... I don't know. I don't think that anyone actually verbatim uses exactly what Carl Jung or Sigmund Freud used, but there might be some out there. In any event, though, the main reason that I think that this integrates well into the Persona series is that Persona actually has a significant amount of psychotherapy in it. In this context, we're going to be talking about the social links, because social links are almost like a sort of junior unregistered psychologist sort of thing going on there, in that you're generally speaking talking to people who have some sort of neurosis in the sort of sense that Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud would have had it used. They've got this sort of idea that there's been some sort of block in the development of the person who's kept them back from reaching their full potential in one way or another. Sigmund Freud would refer to it as being caught in one of the stages during the psychosexual development, whereas Carl Jung would probably refer to it during using self-individuation. And in either case, they believe that this leads you to becoming a neurotic person, as they would say it. And most of the characters in the Persona series have some form of neurosis. And this is actually realistic in the sense of both those theories, and probably in real life as well. Both Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud would say that most people hold some neurosis in them. It's not necessarily going to be crippling, and you're going to be able to see plenty of people who have some sort of neurosis that is holding them back from becoming their full potential, but it's not enough to stop them from doing the majority of things that they want to do in their lives. It could be a minor thing. And a lot of people in modern psychology think that most people can benefit to a certain degree from therapy. Even if they don't feel like they've got any major problems, most people are under a negative stress in their life or something like that, and they're not necessarily going to be coping with it in the most healthy way possible. So, and it really is actually just supposed to be one of those things that's beneficial to be able to sort of vent out your frustrations and have it be commented on in a constructive way rather than simply being affirmed or denied or ignored, which is what, even really good friends are going to potentially bungle the way that they interact with people when they're discussing things that are really stressing them out, either because they might take it too seriously, they might take it too lightly, they might simply affirm negative cognitions that that person is having about that stress, and so on and so forth. So it has to be addressed by someone who's sort of a little bit more impartial sometimes. But in any event, don't feel this is an endorsement that I'm saying that you should all go out and run and get a therapist. They're expensive, so in an ideal world they'd be cheap enough that everyone could go and get one, but unfortunately that's not really the case. But in any event, in Persona, what you're doing is largely you're meeting these new people that you barely know, and you're sort of talking to them to a short period of time and getting to know one of their problems, one of their core problems that's really bothering them. And then you're helping them work through that problem, whether it be, your weird-ass teacher who's working as a maid, or whether it's the doctor who is worried about, or is trying to sort of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde everything. I don't actually know what she's up to, but she's trying to make like all these weird, bizarre medicines, some of which are kind of shifty, but all of them which are ultimately designed to help people. So she's not exactly a bad person. She's just crazy, I'd say, but and not in the neurotic way. I think she's just a little bit, too driven, but that's probably not the best way to put that. But in any event, each of these social links, you're sort of discussing with this person and getting into their sort of inner mind there and trying to resolve this problem by telling them the information that they need to know about it. And you're generally rewarded for telling them what they do need to know rather than trying to just tell them what they want to hear or just telling them what you think. Because generally speaking, there's going to be plenty of social links where it's like, well, this is what I think, and that's going to be the wrong answer because it wasn't what that character needed to hear. It's not what they needed to do about that situation there. Generally speaking, it's going to be something that relates slightly to their arcana as well. You'll see that for all three games, Persona 3, 4, and 5, the Chariot Arcana character always has a sort of similar theme to their problem there, and generally speaking is going to have some sort of similarity in how they approach that problem and that sort of life stance, because they're archetypal characters and they're following a specific kind of archetype, the Chariot archetype, and that applies to sort of all of the characters. And there's enough variation within these, and the definitions of these are loose enough that while there's sort of a similarity at the core of each of these, there's enough differences that it doesn't really feel particularly stale in that sort of sense there. And there's certain arcanas just as a result, because of the way that my personal cognitions work, that I cannot get. In particular, I've never been able to answer the person who is the Devil Arcana in any of the games. I don't know what they want. I can't understand them. I can't sort of empathize with them properly. So I would be a bad match for those people. And therapy is actually one of those things where being a good or a bad match for a particular person is a major indicator as to whether or not that therapy is going to be successful. And this is why I think that this game is kind of interesting, in the sense that you're supposed to sort of get close enough to these people that they can open up to you. Now, obviously, if you're going to a real therapist, even if they're supposed to open up to you, they're not supposed to quite get as attached to you as they do to the main protagonist, which is why I don't think that it's quite analogous to therapy, but it's still got that sort of same underlying core philosophy of trying to find their problem, root problem, and fix that for them. So that generally speaking is what is going on in these games here. So what I find is that generally speaking, you're trying to discuss the problem with them in a way that doesn't really fit with Jungian psychology, and it doesn't really fit with Freudian psychology either. It's kind of a more generic approach to it, and I don't think that it needs to be as formal as either of their psychology is. In a certain sense, though, it could be viewed as being slightly more Jungian in the approach, as opposed to the Freudian style there, since that it basically is about tearing down that barrier between you and that person, that persona that person represents to you, and getting to the core crux of their problem, their inner demons, that shadow that they have, and then sort of addressing it and coming to terms with it. This would be sort of more in line with Carl Jung rather than Sigmund Freud, which I think is a little bit interesting. For Carl Jung, though, it's much more supposed to be a broader journey that's supposed to be a more lifelong pursuit rather than something that could be addressed within a month or two, which is what it is in Persona. So the fact that it's much more rapid, much more skimmed through, is kind of probably a compression done because it's a video game. If it took like an entire lifetime for someone to fully address one of their problems to the core and completely become a self-individualized person, then you're probably looking at a game that's going to take way too long and focus way too much on a small number of characters in a way that is probably unsatisfactory to the sort of it being a video game. So I think that that's sort of what they've gone for, is a much more condensed version of Jung's psychology and his methods there. Some of the things that are missing, though, despite the fact that they're kind of there tangentially, are things like dream analysis. For Carl Jung, dreams were a major gateway into the unconscious. This is actually true for Freud as well, by my recollection. But while dreams are more important for the protagonist, bringing you to places like the Velvet Room and stuff like that, they don't actually discuss dreams too much in the actual context of the characters that you're addressing. And there's supposed to be significant amounts of symbolisms and depth to dreams that can reveal a lot about the person and what things mean. Now, if you're actually thinking that dream analysis isn't really a thing, actually people still do dream analysis because it's an incredibly useful tool for psychologists. And this isn't the sort of thing where you can look online, what does my dream mean? What's important actually in dream analysis is figuring out what the different elements of a dream symbolize to that individual person. What you have to realize is that dreams emerge from your own brain. Okay, it doesn't emerge from some sort of random pattern of things that don't make any sense. The symbols and identities and everything else that you see in your dreams are a result of your own cognition. So these are things that your brain has categorized as being relevant enough to keep in some way or in some capacity. So they're there, and they're tied to things that you are thinking about in one way or another. So by analyzing what those mean to you as a person and what they connect to and how they are important to you, you can sort of figure out a little bit more about what that person is thinking and sort of the depth of a particular issue that is on the mind of that individual. So dream analysis has been around since Freud and Jung to a certain extent, and you could definitely argue that dream analysis has been they're way earlier than those two. Jung, I think, actually would have been more fascinated in it because it's a recurring part of myth and mythology is the recurrence of dreams. And people said that they were prophetic in ages past, but I think that they might have actually been more self-fulfilling prophecies, in that people would have dreams about these things that were very important to them, and since they were important to them, they would then seek them out, making it much more likely that those sort of dream states and those dream symbols would come to them in real life. And so I think that there's definitely a relevance to this. In Persona, you don't really see this sort of dream analysis in anyone other than the protagonist himself, because you only sort of see that character's dreams. It would be kind of interesting if some of the social links that you had would tell you about their dreams and what they were seeing in their sleep or in their dreams or in their nightmares or what have you. You could also say that the shadow world itself is sort of like that. According to Jung, a dream is basically a window or a video into the person's unconscious mind there. So to a certain level, you could say that being in the unconscious directly is analogous to seeing their dreams more directly and with much more clarity than a dream would normally be categorized as. So I think that there is, to a certain degree, that element to it, but never to the people that you're developing social links with. Well, in Persona 4, you did actually delve into the unconscious minds of the people that you developed social links with, but only on a few occasions, and not when you're actually discussing that core problem with them, because they've, by that point, already sort of addressed their shadow and sort of accepted that part of them. They just have to then work through other issues that they have relating to that and tangential to that and hangover effects of that sort of nature. So I think that that is just a major part of Persona that is touched upon aesthetically again here. You've got sort of that sort of imagery of dreams, and you've got that sort of showing of dreams, but it's not really being applied and used in the same way that Carl Jung would have used it or would have liked to see it being used. Other elements to it are things like just discussing people's past. This comes up for some characters, but doesn't necessarily come up for all of them. I think that this is just a very stereotyped part of Sigmund Freud's psychology in particular, but it is actually a fairly valid line of inquiry, because it's generally trying to find the root cause of a person's problems. To Freud and to Carl Jung, to a certain degree, your development could be filled with a lot of problematic and controversial elements that are holding you back and making it difficult for you to progress forward past those problems. And while certain branches of psychology from today's standpoint don't view it as necessary to resolve those issues or to go through those issues, it's perfectly valid to open those up and try and figure out what exactly it is that you have as the core cause of your problems. So, for example, if you're talking to a behavioral psychologist today and you've got a severe phobia of, let's say, spiders, for example, and they're trying to sort of get you past that phobia of spiders, a behavioral psychologist is just going to work on the behavior. So they're going to try and work on, well, actually, we'll go with cognitive behavioral psychologists here. So they're just going to work on your cognitions when you encounter a spider. What are you thinking when you see that spider? And they're going to try and change that cognition, and they're going to try and change that behavior. Whereas a Jungian or a Freudian psychologist is going to try and figure out why you're afraid of spiders, and then trying to get you to resolve that and realize that that's not something that you need to keep with you and try and get past that. They're going to try and get you to resolve that particular issue, and once you've resolved that, you've realized that hopefully that you don't need to be afraid of spiders anymore. And both these techniques to a certain degree can work under certain circumstances. I think for phobias, cognitive behavioral is generally considered the superior methodology, but there are other sort of various problems that you could have, like say generalized anxiety disorders, and so on and so forth. That might be a little bit harder for a cognitive behavioral psychologist to deal with. That might be a little bit easier if you're going through the person's past and figuring out why they're always so anxious and why they've always got these problems with them. But one of the things to remember is that a lot of psychology, a lot of the different schools of thought can actually work, and they can work for various different sort of disorders. So there's no one truly superior type of psychology right now. I think that what they found was the best indicator as to whether or not you're going to get better from therapy is actually compatibility with your particular therapist. And this brings me up to the next point. In general, in these sort of games, you're supposed to try and develop these social links and try and make it so that these people will open up to you in a way that is broadly positive and also constructive, so that you can sort of add constructive criticism to their life and to their particular problem there. And this is pretty accurate. You're supposed to be able to build a rapport with your psychologist, with your therapist, or, you know, with your friend, frankly speaking. If you have a really good friend that you can discuss your problems with, and they're a perceptive person, and they're able to sort of adequately address your problem instead of just, you know, going through your problem and dismissing it, or just brushing it off, or giving you bad advice based around it. Because, you know, let's face it, you know, you might love your friends, but they don't always give you the best advice. But if you have got a friend that you can trust on, rely on to do that sort of stuff, then, you know, they're probably going to be a better source of help for your mental stability than any psychologist or any therapist ever could be. I think that, you know, if you don't have any friends that are capable of really empathizing with you in that sort of context, you know, they're just not capable of dealing with that really serious stuff, that isn't an indicator that they're a bad friend. It just means that, you know, they're bad for that particular thing. So don't hold your friends too harshly if you don't feel like you can talk about major life issues with them. I don't think that that's really anything you need to worry about if that's what your friends are like. And really, I mean, you know, you take your friends for what they are, not what they aren't. And if your friends are not good therapists, then so be it. That's perfectly fine. But at the same token, I also think that you shouldn't psychoanalyze your friends if you happen to be a person that's in psychology. So just because you've gone on into university and gotten into psychology does not mean that I recommend psychoanalyzing your friends on a sort of more informed level. I think that that is a great way to destroy your relationship. But, you know, if they ask for your insights, your advice, always be ready and willing to give it if you can. But that's sort of a bit of a tangent there. So, yeah, Jung's psychology and his psychoanalytic method, it really is just supposed to be more of a journey. And I do think that I wish that it was more of a journey when you're going through these social links. But realistically, there's only 10 chapters, essentially, to each of these. And they're all very, very short. So it's often difficult to unpack a huge amount of Jung's methodology into any of these in particular. But you can sort of see the core of the idea there, and you can sort of see the direction that they're going for, and it is sort of based around that kind of idea of therapy that Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud would have had. So that's all I've really got for our talk about psychology, Carl Jung, and Sigmund Freud today. Not too much about it. Honestly, there's not a whole lot of content that relates back to Persona 5 in terms of therapy other than the social links. I mean, I could go through each of them and talk about why they're therapeutic or not, or in the methods used, or analyze them deeply, but you have to remember, I haven't actually completed the social links in Persona 5, and I want to keep it, at this point, mostly to Persona 5. I could talk a little bit about Persona or Persona 3, but I don't honestly remember those ones quite as well as I remember the one that I'm playing right now, so I would probably get a lot awfully wrong. But I mean, even then, like, most of the stuff that you're discussing through these is like talking to people. Well, let's give an example actually. In Persona 3, we've got your hermit social link. This is one of my favorite social links in the game because it's hilarious. But you're talking to this person online. You've become friends with the person over the internet. And what you're trying to do together is you've created this sort of bond, this sort of friendship. You've played the game together for X number of hours, which is actually probably only like 10 total. So, you know, you're not even very good internet friends by this point in time. But again, we're condensing the time span normally required down here. But this person that you're talking to opens up to you and starts talking about everything, starts talking about her life, and starts talking about these people that she knows, and really appreciates that you'll listen and help and talk to her about these different things. And it turns out eventually that you get a notice that the game that you two play together is being shut down. So what's interesting about this is that you then are essentially going through the different stages of grief, and you're sort of helping her resolve those sort of issues so that she can realize why the game was so important to her. It turns out that, you know, it's just important because it allows her to sort of talk to people and socialize them, and in particular it's important at this point in time because it allows her to talk to you as a character. And it becomes this sort of grief counseling of realizing the core cognition and the core reasoning as to why you're sort of why she needs this game in her life and why she's petitioning for it. And you go through like all the sort of stages of grief. You go through like denial, you go through bargaining, you go through I can't actually remember the stages of grief. Hold on one second here, because I probably should remember this, but I don't. All right, so it's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And For the record, the reason that I don't actually remember this model very well is because it's been somewhat discredited, because there are people who will actually go through the stages of grief either in a different order, or they'll skip steps, or they'll do whatever differently. So it's not really healthy to look at a person and say that they should be going through them in this order in this particular way, because everyone sort of addresses, well, not everyone, there's plenty of people who do address grief in this exact order, and there's plenty of people who address it in similar ways to one another, but you know, people don't have to sort of go through these exact stages of grief, and it's not healthy to sort of try and say that people have to go through a grieving process using these particular steps. But in any event, these are sort of the steps that she goes through during her sort of period where the game is being shut down. You know, she's in denial that's happening. She's angry that's being shut down. She's trying to convince the people who are shutting the game down to not shut it down through petitions and stuff like that. She starts being a little bit depressed about that, and eventually she realizes why the game was so important to her, and she accepts that it's being shut down and is willing to sort of take one last snapshot of it with your character, and then gives up on it. She's willing to accept that the game is gone, and that's going to have to be a thing that she's moved on from in life. Why she didn't just say, let's meet up on a different game is kind of beyond me, but, you know, that apparently is just the way the game decided to deal with that problem. And honestly, it would have been a much less interesting sort of progression there. But you're trying to help her get through these different stages, and you're trying to support her through these different stages and help her sort of acknowledge that this is what's happening, this is what she's going through, and come to the realization of why she thinks it's important. Now, the reason that I think that the social link as a tangent is hilarious is that while you're doing this, she reveals that she has a major crush on your character IRL, which is awkward, and she also reveals that she's your homeroom teacher. So that all is extremely, you know, not great. But then you also are a tremendous asshole and decide to use that picture that she sends you. Like I said, she takes one last snapshot of you two on the beach together in the game. Just as a commemorative photo, and you, for some asinine reason, decide that would make a great screenshot for your cell phone. So eventually she like looks at your cell phone in real life and just is like, well, my life is ruined, and yeah, it probably is. I mean, it's fine because the protagonist dies in that one, so I mean, it's not as though she actually has to worry about anything after that happening, but I mean, you know, probably not great for her either when you know, die. So I mean, it just is just a really, really strange social link. I mean, honestly, the homeroom teacher in all the Persona games are quirky at best. The teacher in Persona 5 is a bit beyond quirky. I would say that maybe she needs help a lot more than the other characters that have had social links need help. And I think that also maybe her help that she needs might not be just psychological in nature. She probably needs some very practical help as well, because she's like literally goes up to you as a student. It's like, can I borrow $100,000? Or I think, what was it? No, it's only $10,000, I think, or something like that. It's like, yeah, no, if you need to ask a student for $10,000, you should probably, I don't know, maybe I don't even know who you possibly could go to get help like in that capacity. It's just not really feasible. But yeah, so that's sort of the example of like a therapy process in Persona as a series, and virtually every social link is in one way or another like this. A lot of grief counseling, because there's a lot of people who are grieving something or other, or coming to accept certain things. But there's certain people that aren't. There's plenty of people that aren't, I'd say. Persona 3 in particular had a lot of deaths that people had to get past, because again, the theme of Persona 3 was death. To a certain extent, I would say that Persona 3 was still Jungian psychology rather than Freud's model, but like you had very few instances of asking people about their mother, although honestly, you know, that's a little bit of a cliche. But I do think that there's definitely room to incorporate more of Jung's methodology into any of these given little tidbits. So let's talk about Persona 5 now. Where have I gotten to in the game? Well, I've gotten to the point where I've beaten the Madarame's level, the painting level, and I'm actually nearing the end of Kaneshiro's level, the bank level. And what's sort of interesting to me is when I beat Madarame, I actually had gotten to the point where I had this sort of impression in my head that, you know, what probably was going to have happened at some point in the past in this game, or in the game's lore or whatever, was that Madarame had actually killed Yusuke's mother. either to get access to Yusuke or for some other reason. And while I wasn't quite right on that, I was actually extremely close. And the reason that I thought that that was going to happen was there was some buildup that made me think that that was probably going to be the case. But two, it's a kind of a cliche, actually, that that be the case, where this orphaned person of immense talents comes under the wing of some other person who is highly corrupt. Well, how did they end up there? Well, their parent died, but don't worry, the adult or the person taking care of them and their parent were friends, so that's why he's taking them under his wing. And, you know, where the sort of twist of that is, generally speaking, that actually that person's parents were actually killed by the person who's now looking after them. That's kind of a cliche in a certain sense there. And I didn't actually mind that when that was the reveal. And it wasn't quite the reveal. He didn't actually kill her. He actually just let her die. She was in a position where she could have been easily saved, and he just let her die. But as far as, you know, the general twist goes, that's pretty much close enough for my tastes. The reason that I think that this is interesting is that it made me sort of remember that Persona as a series is based on very archetypal stories. That is to say that all of the stories that are in Persona are stories that have been told. You can think of each of the individual chapters as being their own sort of story arc, and generally speaking, that's how I sort of analyze them. Madarame's story arc is one that I found to be of that sort of type, of a very talented protege being taken under the wing of someone who is using them. Well, how did he end up there? You know, in that sort of unethical way of having killed his initial parents. Making it a much more sort of personal revenge story in that sort of case there. And I think that to a certain degree, like, Persona has never been about having extremely original stories. It's always been about telling stories that we've heard a million times extremely, extremely well. Now, the story as a whole might be new and original in the sort of conception of what you're doing and the grand scheme of things, but usually it's small, more interpersonal stories that make the game interesting. And it's those sort of like individual stories between you and a few other people, rather than the grand stakes of the overarching plot of the game, I think that make the game compelling and interesting to play. There are plenty of games out there where, you know, you're a team of people, you're supposed to save the world from X, Y, or Z, and that is the general overarching plot and story of all of the Persona games so far. Persona 3, you're trying to save the world from Nyx, and you don't even realize that that's your goal until like 10 months into the game or 9 months into the game. In Persona 4, you're trying to save the world from ignorance as put down by the fog used by Izanagi no Okami, and you know, you don't know that she's the one doing it until literally like the last month of the game. And in this game, I think that the similar sort of thing is going to happen, but you're being, you know, you're actually being foreshadowed in this case that the fate of the world sort of resides on your shoulders in this particular case. Although I think that this Igor might be lying or something, or this Igor might be a fake or something else is going on with this one, because he's definitely different than a normal one, in the sense that normally, like, Igor doesn't really tell you that you have to succeed or the world is doomed. He'll allude to the fact that it is, but he'll also say that if that's the way it goes, then that's what you've chosen to do. Just take responsibility for it. I'll guide you if you want to, but it's your choice ultimately. Be responsible. In this one, that's not really what's happening with Igor, and I think that that's very interesting because, you know, the stakes are not any higher here than they were with Nyx or with Izanagi. They're just as high as far as I can tell, because I mean, how much more can you go than complete annihilation of people of all life as it was in 3, or just everyone turning into sort of clueless people who don't care about knowledge? I guess you could actually get a lot worse than that. That probably fits reality pretty well, given the certain current climate, but I think that there is, to a certain degree, going to be a kind of general twist to this game, therefore. One of the things that I've noticed about this game is that, like, this entire first chapter and the way that they're sort of framing the way that you cut back and forth between 6 months into the game and the present in the, 6 months into the game and sort of wherever you are in the game, cutting back and forth like that. I think that what's happening is that it almost feels like that sort of montage at the beginning of a movie, of a heist movie in particular, where you're collecting together the team, like Ocean's 11 sort of thing there. And you're trying to get the team together, and you're sort of assembling who's who and who's the cast and what do they do. Like, what's this guy do? He's the bomb guy. This is the talker guy. This is the computer guy. That's what it feels like you're doing here. And one of the biggest twists in that's almost always present in these sort of heist movies is when one of the characters gets caught, and it looks like everything's going really poorly. But it turns out that that character got caught intentionally. And you sort of do this sort of cut back to all these other people doing this thing and showing eventually the lead up and the build up to that person getting caught. I think that is probably going to be what's happening here, because it's such a cliched storyline, and it's such a, like, here's the thing. I don't actually think that cliched and overused storylines are bad. I think that using them poorly is bad. But Persona is one of those games that takes these really old story elements, like I just said, and plays them out and plays them straight and does a really, really damn good job of it. And I think that's exactly what we're going to be seeing here. I think that there's some sort of reason why he's been caught here, and like, it's a dead giveaway. The Persona series is really not subtle about the way they telegraph twists. So if it turns out that is the end of the game and that's sort of how it ends, then that's going to be very surprising to me. But generally speaking, for example, you know who the next character in your roster is going to be. It's that person that the game has been emphasizing and focusing on and having you talk to all the time that isn't in your party roster and which you don't have a social link to. So we could take a look sort of at Persona 4 for that. You could have that part of the game where everyone's talking about, like, Yukiko. Like, Persona 4 is actually the worst at this, because it's like, how do we know that this person's going to be our new party member? Well, they got thrown into the TV. Oh, well, yeah, that makes it kind of obvious. In this one, they're doing some sort of a similar thing, you knew that you were going to have Ryuji in your team very, very early on. He was the guy who, like, just stumbled into the palace with you at the very, very start there. But in the start of the game, you had Anne, and you were talking to her a lot and talking about her a lot, and you even saw her sometimes in the palace there, and she didn't have a social link with you, and she joins the team. Now, the two red herrings in this are that Mishima and Shio are also in that category of being talked about a lot and being sort of in proximity to you a lot, but you haven't developed a social link with either of them yet. I think actually arguably Mishima, you can said you did actually he does join in the party in a certain unconventional sense there. Well, he's not fighting with you, he is actually directly supporting you, unlike a lot of the other social links that's there. So you could actually definitely say that he's part of the Phantom Thieves. He's like their PR agent or something like that. Whereas like another one, like we've gotten to the point where I've met Goro Akechi and I've developed the social link with him a little bit. I've started the social link with him. And this tells me that he's not going to be joining my team, because the formula in this game is you meet a person, they'll sort of bother you for a while, you'll dive into the palace with them at some point for whatever reason, and they'll sort of discover what's going on, they'll join the team, and then you'll finish off that palace, which relates to them in some way or another. That's how they get drawn in typically. And once you've sort of concluded that chapter, after that, you're able to get the social link developed. So that sort of is the kind of telegraphing that they do as to who's going to join the party. Similarly, they always telegraph what the main plot is going to be, both through television broadcasts in this game, television broadcasts in Persona 4 as well to a certain extent. Like in Persona 4, they would even just be like, they'd have a TV special that was completely unrelated to the midnight hour, or sorry, midnight channel or TV world, rather. Getting all my Persona stuff mixed up here, but they would always have like a TV broadcast where the person would show up on TV in one way or another doing something, and you'd be like, oh, that means they're going to show up on the midnight channel, and then you'd watch that, and then they would get thrown into TV. And like this would happen pretty consistently, and it would be pretty much just like, well, yeah, we know who's going to end up in the TV next, and we know what the next world is going to be about, and we know what the next theme is going to be. So that's all good. So like they're very, very heavy-handed with the way that they use foreshadowing, but that doesn't really matter. Part of it is, going into something knowing what's going to happen. I think this goes back to a certain extent about like the Greek theater that I was talking about in one of our previous ones. You know what's going to happen in most of these stories. Most of these stories are not ones that people watch without having knowledge about what's going to happen. You watch Oedipus knowing that he's going to have had sex with his mother. He's going to have murdered his father. It's him that is as the culprit. And people just want to see how it plays out. They want to see the actors. They want to see the action. And they don't really care about the twists or turns of the story. They want to go into it with the comfort of knowing what those are going to be, allowing them to enjoy the performance without having to speculate. I think the same sort of thing goes for Persona here. And I think that because they're sort of leaning so heavily on that sort of idea, I definitely feel like the fact that they've said that tell me about, she tells you at the very start of the game, I think, or at very near the start of the game, it's like, tell me about what happened when you joined Shujin Academy 6 months ago. And this is a massive tell for a Persona game, because all of the games so far have been 1 year long. Persona 3, you start in whenever, and it ends 1 year after that. Persona 4, you're there for 1 year. And I don't imagine that Persona 5 is going to be any different. So the fact that they've said 6 months tells me that that is the halfway point of the game. So if that is, in fact, where it ends, I'm going to be extremely surprised, or I'm going to have found out that I, got the bad end or something like that. But generally speaking, these games have that. Not only that, but they also have the point where you can lose the game, or you can complete the game with a bad ending. Persona 3 could end 3 months early if you're willing to simply forget about everything and allow Nyx to destroy the world. Persona 4 could end early if you allowed... I can't remember actually which one ended the game earliest. I think if you... I didn't actually get the bad ending in Persona 4, so I don't remember the details of it very well. But I think there's an option to just assume that one person is guilty and that they're the final culprit and that you don't have to look anymore. This causes the rest of the world to fall into ignorance, and this means that everything else stays in a fog forever. I think that in that particular ending, your cousin doesn't ever wake up from her coma. But I can't remember anything else as far as that goes. I think that ends the game like 2 months early. I'm expecting a similar thing happening here, where if I don't do things correctly, I'm going to end the game 6 months early as opposed to at the proper ending. So it'll be interesting seeing sort of how that goes, and it's interesting to see that this game sort of is willing to telegraph so much so obviously and still be such a compelling story. I'm kind of wondering, like, maybe I am just genre savvy or something like that, but I get the feeling like I like this is all supposed to be fairly obvious, like on the nose sort of commentary or gameplay or what have you. So maybe if you didn't think this way, or if it turns out that I'm wrong, I'm going to be a little bit more surprised. But honestly, I think that these games are just brilliant in the way that they execute their storytelling. Even if the twists and turns aren't original and they are not necessarily unpredictable, they're usually a whole lot of fun to get through and to watch. And I think part of that is just because you can be watching it and feel that sort of familiarity with the story and feel like what's going on, what's happening. I think that all adds to it a lot more than it detracts from it. So anyway, that's my thoughts on Persona 5 as to where I am right now. We'll get back to you some more on next Tuesday Talk Show. Hope you found this one enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.